Hello and welcome. My name is Maxime Schreier. I'm a professor at Boston College and an associate here at the Davis Center at Harvard University, where I chair the seminar on Russian and Eurasian Jewry. Thank you so much for joining us for this very interesting and important presentation by Professor Viktoria Chytrer, whom I will introduce very shortly. Before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the support of Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies and, of course, the Davis Center, our intellectual home here, and our colleagues at the Davis Center, especially Laura Sargent, for putting this event together. I also want to mention that this is the last event of the fall semester of 2022. We will have other events in the spring. And lastly, as you probably know, we have tried ever since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're now in the 9th month of this terrible war. We have tried to reflect in our programming questions that are relevant to the bigger picture of Eurasian Jewry and to Ukraine. Last semester, you probably remember, we had Wendy Lauer speaking about the Shoah in Ukraine, and then we had Yakov Falkov earlier in the fall, who spoke about, let me just let the dog out, who spoke about, excuse me, the question of what the Soviet intelligence knew about the Shoah. And finally, today, this very exciting lecture by Professor Viktoria Chytrer, who is a great historian of Ukraine and of Russian and Eurasian Jewry. She is professor of history at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. I just want to say that Millersville University is a wonderful state university in the heart of Amish country in right outside York, Pennsylvania. And for years, it had I believe one of the oldest, if not the oldest, conference on the Holocaust in all of North America, which Professor Chytrer directed very ably. She is a founding member of the Academic Council of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv, Ukraine. She's the author and editor of 7 books and over 100 articles on Ukrainian, Russian, and Eastern European Jewish history and the Holocaust. Her book, Jewish City, or Inferno of Russian Israel, A History of the Jews in Kyiv before February 1917, which was published in 2016. And I'm very happy to add that it came out in the series that I curate for Academic Studies Press. This book received the Choice Outstanding Academic Titles Award. Professor Chytrer also published the book Jewish Pogroms in Kyiv during the Russian Civil War, 1918 to 1920, and 2 books about Jewish archival collections in Kyiv archives. She also edited 3 volumes of the Millersville University Holocaust Conference proceedings, and I've been privileged to participate in this conference and contribute to these volumes. Viktoria Chytrer is currently completing her new monograph titled Echo of Babyn Yar, Commemoration and Memorialization of the Holocaust in Kyiv, which is also the title of Professor Chytrer's talk this afternoon. Viktoria, Vika, I'm so happy that you were able to join us. Welcome. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a big honor for me to present my forthcoming book for Harvard and other audience. And I would like to share my screen to show you illustrations. And just a second, share. I hope that everybody can see the screen, and just a moment. I would like to go from beginning. So people often ask me why you choose such a difficult topic for your research. And I tell them that I am Kyivan in 5th generation. And I have on my mother's side and my father's side relatives who perished in Babyn Yar. Before World War II, in Kyiv lived 224,000 Jews. It was second after Moscow by size Jewish community in the Soviet Union. Jews made in Kyiv 26.5% of population. And Kyiv was the center of Jewish culture and Jewish scholarship, one of the centers of Jewish culture and Jewish scholarship in Soviet Union. There was a Jewish district, Podol, where dominate actually Jewish population. And there are many Jewish schools, Jewish institutions. Some of them were already closed in second half of 1930s, but Jews continue to live in Kyiv. And of course, nobody could imagine then that such tragedy can happen in mid of 20th century. Of course, Soviets, before they signed Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, talk about Nazi regime, persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, but Holocaust did not start then yet. And because of this, Jews in Kyiv may heard about persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany, but they did not imagine that entire population can be really destroyed, annihilated by Nazis. And when start World War II and when Nazi attacked the Soviet Union, there were debates among Jewish population whether they need to go to evacuation or not. First of all, to go to evacuation was not so easy because Soviet government evacuate factories, plants, celebrities, top officials, but they did not evacuate common people. And because of this, in Kyiv remain many women with children. Many women before World War II did not work. Also in Kyiv remain many elderly people that did not have opportunity to go to evacuation. And by different calculation in Kyiv remain by time of Nazi occupation, it's September 1941, from 50 to 70,000 Jews. We don't know exact number because in chaos of first months of a Nazi war against Soviet Union, nobody really count how many people went to evacuation, how many were drafted to army, how many remain in the city. We have a statistic, Soviet statistic about evacuation plans, but in factories, but we don't have a really statistics of evacuation of population. In addition to this, some did not go with official evacuation, they just fled from the city. But approximately, as I said, by time of Nazi occupation, September 1941, in Kyiv remain from 50 to 70,000 Jewish people. And Babyn Yar then was just a ravine in outskirts of the city. Now it's inside of city, but then it basically was suburb of the city. And Nazi, a few days before execution of Jews, spread 2,000 announcement in Kyiv that all Jews of Kyiv, 8 o'clock on Monday, September 29, should come to the corner of Melnikova and Degtyarovsky Street and they threaten that who did not come will be executed, and who will hide Jews also would be executed. The announcement was published in Ukrainian and German, and also it used word Yid, insulting, of course, a word for Jews, instead word Jews. And not everybody who was in Kyiv, but we can say majority of Jews who remain in Kyiv subordinate to Nazi order. When people ask why they did not resist, we should remember who remained in Kyiv. All adult men from 18 to 60 years old were drafted to the army. And in Kyiv remain either elderly people or women with children. You can see Kyivan Jews who perished in Babyn Yar. It mostly women and children and elderly people. Nazi provide execution 2 days, September 29, 1941, and September 30, 1941. But after this, still several days, auxiliary troops continue shooting of Jews who originally did not show up on execution place, but hid in some basements or in woods. They search for these Jews, and if they found them, they continue to shoot them by different sources. Some say until October 5th. And after this, still 2 years of Nazi occupation of Kyiv, they continue to execute their Jews, prisoners of the war, Jewish and Gentiles. They continue to execute in Babyn Yar also Roma, mentally ill people, and members of underground movement and Ukrainian nationalists until November 6, 1943, until the city was liberated by Red Army. However, few months before withdrawal from Kyiv, Nazis understood that they can be charged for crimes they committed in this area. And they forced prisoners of the war who first were forced to cover bodies of the Jews, dig up these bodies and burn them created their crematoriums, and most of bodies were destroyed. This is why impossible by all interrogation after the war to say exactly how many people were executed there. Few prisoners of the war who actually were Jewish, you can see Fim Wilkes, also Leonid Ostrovsky and Vladimir Davidov, provide their testimonies that they participate in burning the bodies of these executed Jews and Gentiles in Babyn Yar. And by their calculation, there were killed about 100,000 people. Of course, this approximate estimation, they cannot really count, but they see how many were built crematoriums, how many bodies approximately were destroyed there. I should say a few more words about these people. On September 29, 1943, exactly 2 years after beginning of execution of Jews in Babyn Yar, prisoners of Seretz concentration camp, 300 prisoners who participate in this exhumation of corpses from Babyn Yar, rebelled, uprised against Nazis, and tried to escape from their concentration camp that was just on the outskirts of Babyn Yar. They ran away, Nazis start shoot them, and only by different calculation from 14 to 18 people were able to escape. They ran in different directions, and later some of them were drafted to Red Army who survived, and some of them perished already on the front during the war. And these 3 prisoners of Soviet concentration camp were main eyewitnesses of Nazi crimes on the process in Kyiv after liberation of city. Furthermore, Vladimir Davidov talked to Khrushchev when Khrushchev visited Babyn Yar, and to these 3 prisoners of Soviet concentration camp also talked to foreign correspondents and Soviet correspondents who visited Babyn Yar immediately after its liberation. Soviets actually first publicized a tragedy in Babyn Yar as Nazi crimes, war crimes against civilian population. Soviet press wrote about Babyn Yar already in October, November 1941, soon after mass execution of Jewish people. And what is interesting, that first publication still emphasized that were executed Jewish people there. But soon Soviet language of publication start to change and were emphasized first Ukrainian, Russian victims and Jews were moved on the 3rd place. So in official note that sent Soviet foreign commissar or foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov to all countries with whom Soviet Union had diplomatic relations in on January 6, 1942, he wrote that Nazis committed their horrible crimes against civilian population, that there were executed 52,000 peaceful citizens, including Russian, Ukrainians, and Jews. Jews were on the 3rd place, but they still were listed as victims. Later, Soviet documents try just talk about peaceful Soviet citizens or Kyivans. They did not emphasize any more Jewish victims. And the reason for this was the rise popular and state anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. What is interesting that when Soviets try to advertise the crimes that committed Nazis on Soviet territory to get more support from Western allies in war effort, more humanitarian aid. First, foreign correspondents who were brought to Babyn Yar site hardly believe, they basically refuse to believe on dimension of these crimes. The problem was that it was in November 1943, soon after liberation of Kyiv, and then people in the West still did not heard about mass killing centers. They were not liberated yet. Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, they did not know yet about mass execution of Jewish people and prisoners of the war there. And you can see that Buffalo Courier Express, American newspaper, published article by Lawrence that had title, "Little Evidence Supports Story of Nazi Atrocities." So he believed that a Soviet exaggerate number of executed people, that there could not be executed so many people. And as I said, most of corpses were destroyed by Nazis, burned by prisoners of the war by order of Nazis before Nazis retreated from Kyiv. Soviets originally planned to build a monument in Babyn Yar, and they even provide for this a significant amount of money. And a Soviet sculptor Vlasov and sculptor Kruglov prepared the model of monument already in 1945. The monument should be like a black pyramid with a barrelief of women cried over a child. This barrelief or monument detail from this monument that never was built. Good question, why this monument was not built? Vlasov was main architect of city of Kyiv and later main architect of city of Moscow. And all other his plans, like reconstruction of main street of Kyiv, Kreshchatik, was realized. He built many other buildings in Kyiv and Moscow. And monument in Babyn Yar never was realized. The main reason for this was anti-Semitism in the city. In 1945 was a pogrom in Kyiv, and Soviet Ukrainian authorities decided that this situation would be appropriate build any monument in Babyn Yar. They postponed it. Furthermore, in 1950 appeared a plan, the total liquidation of Babyn Yar ravine and construction there, recreation park, road, and they start to pulp the mud in the Babyn Yar ravine, basically to liquidate this ravine, to fill it with waste from the brick factories. This is a photo by Soviet writer Viktor Nekrasov. You can see a portrait of Viktor Nekrasov, who was actually first who in 1959, 2 years before Yevtushenko, raised a question in his essay in Literaturnaya Gazeta, why no monument in Babyn Yar? Why we all today remember poetry of Yevtushenko and not many people know about essay of Nekrasov? I can say that poetry of Yevtushenko have much wider resonance because Yevtushenko first talked openly about Jewish victims of Babyn Yar. In essay of Nekrasov, there is question why no monument in the place where perished 100,000 people. He also mentioned that monuments were built in places like Buchenwald and other place of mass execution of people, but not in Kyiv, not in Babyn Yar. But we don't know whether Nekrasov himself did not use word Jews or Soviet censorship may just erase this word from his essay. We know for sure that Viktor Nekrasov always have many Jewish friends, that he always support Jews when were persecution of Jews in Soviet Union during anti-cosmopolitan campaign. He definitely was a Philosemite, and he definitely, his essay opened the topic why no commemoration of victims of Babyn Yar in Kyiv. In 1961, appeared a new tragedy in which was involved Babyn Yar. There was mud flood. All this mud from brick factories that Soviets authorities put there to erase this ravine, to turn it to the park, broke the dam, and the mud wave went to the city. Many Kyivans took it as a day of atonement. It's a day of retribution, revenge for betrayal memory of people who perished there. In this day, March 13, 1961, in Kyiv were killed by official information 150 people. Non-official information said that 1,500 people, but this mud wave. At same year, in 1961, Yevtushenko came to Kyiv. And another writer, Anatoly Kuznetsov, brought him to Babyn Yar. And Yevtushenko said that he was shocked from what he saw there, because he anticipated to see there some monument, at least memorial plaque. But instead, he saw basically just place where truck dump garbage. It was turned to chest pit that have terrible smell. And Yevtushenko said that he was so shocked by this neglection by Soviet authorities of this tragedy that he wrote poetry, his famous poetry, Babyn Yar, that was translated for dozens of languages very soon. And first time he read his poetry in Kyiv. Later, when he returned to Moscow, he published it in Literaturnaya Gazeta. And next year, Shostakovich, renowned Soviet composer, composed his symphony number 13 based on Yevtushenko poetry, including Babyn Yar. 5 years later, Anatoly Kuznetsov wrote his novel. I can say that Yevtushenko and Kuznetsov basically put under risk their career, literature career, by turning to Jewish topic. And they clearly understood this, because Kuznetsov talked actually to Yevtushenko first time about Babyn Yar still in 1950s. And what is interesting that other members of Union of Soviet Writers talk about Kuznetsov, that probably he is Jewish himself, why he feel any compassion to Jews. They even, Kuznetsov then was a young writer, call him Zhidyonak, according to Yevtushenko memory. Oh, this Zhidyonak, this means little Yid. Write about Babyn Yar because he probably Jewish himself, he just hides this. And really, while liberals greeted publication of Yevtushenko poetry and Kuznetsov novel, some conservative poets and writers call Yevtushenko and Kuznetsov that they traitors, that they betrayed Russian people, that they write about Jews when so many Russians perished during the war. Interesting that in this heated debate, then involve Soviet government. They feel like they need to react. Khrushchev and other members of government. And Khrushchev try to tell Yevtushenko that he provoked anti-Semitism, that don't need divide Soviet people by nationalities. If you divide them by nationalities, you provoke anti-Semitism in Soviet Union. Really, nothing was provoked. All these processes, we can say, philo-Semitic and anti-Semitic, were just suppressed. under official Soviet concept by universal suffering of Soviet people. While I think Soviet authorities knew quite well that 80% those who perished in Babyn Yar were Jewish people, and only Jews and Roma were killed due to their ethnicity, including women, children, and elderly people. There were executed also prisoners of the war, Gentile prisoners of war, Ukrainian nationalists in Babyn Yar, but they were executed for their political views, for resistance to Nazi regime. But as I said, only two groups of people, Roma and Jewish people, were executed due to their nationality. But commemoration of Babyn Yar was politicized from the beginning. As you can see, Soviets first try really politicize this tragedy as mass atrocity of Nazis against civilian population. Then, in years of Stalin anti-cosmopolitan campaign and Cold War, was silence over Babyn Yar tragedy. Then again, during Khrushchev's thaw, when liberal intelligentsia received opportunity at least raise some topics forbidden before in the press, they tried to say that it was Jewish tragedy. But Soviet government continued to insist it was universal suffering of Soviet people. Interesting that foreign tourists, especially Jewish foreign tourists, very much want to see some memorial, some commemoration of Babyn Yar tragedy. And Elie Wiesel visited Kyiv in 1965. He asked then first officials to bring him to Babyn Yar. He did not receive any response for his request. Then he asked some taxi driver to take him to Babyn Yar. And taxi driver instead take him to Babyn Yar, took him in some random place. And Elie Wiesel said, first, he was very disappointed because he understood that taxi driver cheated him. But later he said that he understood that Babyn Yar not a geographical place, he wrote. Babyn Yar is Kyiv. Babyn Yar is all Ukraine. What he mean? He means that it's government policy toward a commemoration of Holocaust in Babyn Yar that hide this Holocaust. Basically, this soft denial of Holocaust about which wrote Deborah Lipstadt. So they hide it by saying universal tragedy, Soviet people suffer, and so on. But under pressure of public opinion in Soviet Union and abroad, Soviet authorities announced in 1965 competition for monument in Babyn Yar. And one of conditions of this competition was that the monument should show universal suffering of Soviet people. In this competition were submitted over 60 projects of monuments, and some of them were very interesting in abstractionist style, as monument model by Iosif Karakis, whose mother perished in Babyn Yar. Or, as you can see, Avram Miletsky, renowned architect in Kyiv, who built many buildings, also created his project together with two Ukrainian sculptors, Ada Rebechuk and Vladimir Melnichenko, also in abstractionist style. And despite for we can say variety of different projects, Soviets again postponed construction of monument for many years. Why? They afraid that whatever they build there would not satisfy one or other group of population. They did not want to build something in abstractionist style, first of all, because they believe it should be socialist realism, the dominant style in Soviet Union. Second, they want something universal that doesn't show really Jewish tragedy. And of course, a Jewish population of Kyiv and liberal intelligentsia were bitterly disagree with this. And when nothing was built again in 1966, they organized improvised meeting, actually even two improvised meetings in Babyn Yar. Jewish activists wrote in two languages, in Hebrew and also in Russian. Babyn Yar, 25 years of massacre, 1941-1966. And you can see that Viktor Nekrasov participated in both these meetings. One was on September 24, 1966, other in day of massacre anniversary, September 29, 1966. And on second meeting came about 1,000 Kyivans. It were Jews and Gentiles. Interesting that in this meeting participate prominent Russian and Ukrainian writers like Viktor Nekrasov, Vainovich, Vladimir Vainovich, also Ukrainian writer Ivan Dzyuba, and several others. And they did not have microphones. They basically just talk, and we can say the people pass their words, but just their appearance on this meeting was very meaningful for Jewish people. They said, look who came to us. There was lots and lots of respect for Viktor Nekrasov, for Ivan Dzyuba in Kyiv. And also interesting that Ivan Dzyuba talked about that Jewish people and Ukrainian people should be together, that this tragedy in Babyn Yar is not only Jewish tragedy, but it's a tragedy for all people who live in this land. And he tried talk about necessary commemoration and cooperation in memory projects of Ukrainian and Jewish people. Soviet authorities, of course, hate these improvised meetings. There quite soon, according to memoirs of members of these meetings, arrive Soviet police, and many people who participate in this meeting were fired from their positions, were under observation by KGB, and later several of them were arrested for their dissident activities, not only for Babyn Yar, but other dissident activities. And Viktor Nekrasov was forced to leave the Soviet Union. Ivan Dzyuba was arrested several years later. And when they were arrested, he was arrested, of course, Soviet incriminate to him also participation in this meeting in Babyn Yar, along with other dissident activities. But Soviets should react on wish of the people to see their monument. And 2 weeks after this improvised meeting in Babyn Yar, after the 25th anniversary of tragedy of massacre in Babyn Yar, Soviets put this pitiful, I would say, stone and wrote on the stone that on this side will be a monument to victims of fascism, Holocaust, Nazi regime in Soviet Union. during the German occupation of Kyiv in 1941-1943. But monument was built only in 1976, so it took another 10 years to build monument there. The author of this monument was renowned Ukrainian sculptor Mikhail Lysenko. And interesting that first he had planned monument as monument of mother with tied hands behind her back that still breastfeeding a baby. This is supposed to be original project of monument. But Soviet censorship did not agree with this project and said we need to show heroic resistance of Soviet people to Nazi regime. And they forced him to add to monument sculptures of sailor, soldier, and member of resistance movement. Then also appeared other figures on monument. Other figures that Lysenko and two his assistants, young sculptors, and his students, Vitrik and Sukhenko, added to monument was a figure of girl then crying over the body of old dead man. Viktor Sukhenko, Mikhail Lysenko, and Alexander Vitrik all were Christian, and I think these figures more remind me Peter. Just instead Saint Mary that crying over Jesus Christ, they depicted a girl that crying over body of dead man, and they said, at least later, that they tried to depict Jewish figures on monument. And for a long time, after monument was ready, it was ready project of monument already in 1968, Soviet authorities did not allow to build it. They still postponed construction. But in 1970s was period of detente when Soviet Union tried to improve relation with other countries, Western countries. And there was lots of pressure on Soviet Union by their so much anti-Semitism, by not allowed commemoration of Holocaust. And then they allowed construct this monument, and basically at the same time was built a monument on Rostov-on-Don, on the place of largest massacre in Russian Federation, and Rostov-on-Don were executed about 30,000 people, most of whom were Jewish. And what is interesting that first they did not allow construction this monument over all bans and demands of Soviet censors. Mikhail Lysenko received heart attack and died in the age of 65, but his students Vitrik and Sukhenko were able to finish this monument. In the last few years, they work under big pressure of authorities that begging them to finish monument as soon as possible. They told them that monument should be ready soon, that this basically question for them of life and death. That monument should be complete quite fast. And later, during construction of this monument, they start to bring their foreign delegation and show them their construction site and show that they are Jewish figures. And some rabbis that arrived from Great Britain even prayed there in front of this unfinished monument, according to sculptural memories. The monument was opened in July 1976, And Soviet authorities intentionally opened it in the middle of summer that less people came there, take less attention. But you can see there was lots of people and lots of attention on opening ceremony of this monument. However, many people were disappointed that nothing Jewish, according to them, in monument. They did not see these figures probably on the back or did not take them as Jewish. And sign on the monument said that it monument to 100 Kyivans that perished during the fascist occupation of Kyiv. Only after collapse of communism was built first Soviet monument, menorah, in Jewish monument, menorah in Babyn Yar. It was erected in 1991 by architect Yuri Paskevich. And what is interesting is that many times it was defaced thereafter. Some anti-Semites never want to admit that this place of Jewish suffering. Furthermore, Jews already in independent Ukraine were accused that they tried to privatize Babyn Yar, while there were killed also 600 Ukrainian nationalists and several thousand of prisoners of the war. But again, would like to emphasize that 80%, at least 80% of victims of Babyn Yar were Jewish. In time of independence of Ukraine, were many projects and monuments that were built and not built there. This monument to children in Babyn Yar that was erected in 2001, and monument to member of resistance movement, Tanya Marcus, who was Jewish, that was erected in Babyn Yar. Were several projects of constructions of museum in Babyn Yar. This is a winning project of museum design by Austrian architect that's supposed to build there. In 2020, there was open new memorial that calls their mirror field, and there are 32 pillars that shot by bullets, and sound installation that reads the names of victims of Babyn Yar. However, in independent Ukraine, again appeared a controversy what should be a museum. The main reason why museum was not built for 30 years of Ukrainian independence and before the war, because appeared a big controversy what museum should be built in Babyn Yar. While Babyn Yar Center proposed to build the Museum of Holocaust, Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Museum, some local historians insisted that there should be built two different museums, Museum of Babyn Yar and Holocaust Museum separately, that Babyn Yar should not be just place of Jewish commemoration. The controversy continued until the present, in spite of war. But we can say that Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center that was established in 2017 did lots of research about history of Babyn Yar and built several other important memorial places there. One of them is a wooden synagogue that was opened in 2021 that remind wooden synagogues that were in Ukraine before Holocaust. Many of them were destroyed by Nazis. And there was by renowned movie director Sergei Loznitsa made several films documentary films about Babyn Yar. On the 80th anniversary of Babyn Yar tragedy, many foreign leaders arrived there, President of Israel, President of Germany, And I participate in this event. It was very, we can say, touchy, especially for Kyivans, because there during all event were scrolled the names of Holocaust victims who perished in Babyn Yar, took the last people who survived the Holocaust, last, we can say, Holocaust survivors who are still alive, was open a new monument that calls a crystal vault of crying. And were planned next year, this year, to construct 2 new museums, so-called Kurgan of Memory, Mount of Memory, and the old Jewish cemetery office should be turned. Jewish cemetery closed long time ago by Soviet authorities, but this building that served as dormitory during the Soviet period supposed to turn to a museum of history of oblivion about how Soviets tried to erase memory of Babyn Yar. Russian war against Ukraine, of course, destroyed all these plans. Furthermore, the ground of Babyn Yar became a site of attack on March 1st, 2022. And then President of Ukraine, Zelensky, said, why we say never again for 80 years when ground of Babyn Yar again attacked by Russian airstrike, and this attack killed 5 people who actually walked to Babyn Yar to commemorate memory people who perished there. So Babyn Yar Center now mostly turned to humanitarian aid activities and commemoration of victims already of new war against Ukraine, and investigation of crimes that committed their Russian occupiers, because they were not in Kyiv itself, but on the outskirts of the city, in Borodyanka, in other towns that are very close to the city, in Korostin, in other places. And unfortunately, all this project of commemoration and construction of museum and also educational centers in Babyn Yar were postponed for unknown time. But I think when war will be over, then again Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center with a good group of scholars that they have can turn back to their research projects, to construction of museum. And I believe that one day large modern museum of Holocaust of Kyivan Jews in Babyn Yar will be open in the city. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you so much, Prosecutor, for this very moving and informative presentation. I was particularly grateful to you for the long narrative that you presented going back to 1941 and the way you were able to bring it to the present, to the context of the ongoing war and Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I wonder if we could pick up precisely on that point as we also await questions from the audience. Would that be okay? So I wonder if we could probe a little further something you mentioned, which is the attack of March 1st of this past spring, right when several Russian missiles came dangerously close to the memorial sites. They didn't damage, luckily, the memorials, but it was very close. And specifically, how in the coverage of that, the question of the commemoration and memorialization of Babyn Yar was addressed. I remember having to field some questions from the press about it, and some of them were a little naive about the whole context. However, I want to mention something that I'm sure, Victoria, you know about, that on that very day, on March 1st, Rabbi Moshe Reuven Assman, who is the Chabad Lubavitch rabbi of the Brodsky Choral Synagogue in Kyiv, and who is often referred to as one of the chief rabbis of Ukraine, recorded this very moving address, which is available on YouTube. It's in Russian, but it's available dubbed in English with subtitles. And basically, he specifically spoke about the Russian aggression against Ukraine and of questions of justice, memory, Jewish suffering, and he referred to the words with which the Jews of Kyiv were led to their death, and specifically, he said that they walked to their death with the words of the Shema, on their lips. And I wonder if you could speak more about the way the question of the legacy of Babyn Yar and of Jewish suffering is playing itself out in the present conflict, or how it is used, or I hate to say it, spun in that connection.
Thank you very much for your question. I can say that President Zelensky several times appealed to government of Israel and tried to talk about suffering of Jewish people and Ukrainian people, that Jewish people very much should understand this, because many of them have Ukrainian roots. Before World War II, 2.5 million Jewish people lived in Ukraine, and many people who live now in Israel have Ukrainian Jewish ancestors. And also, I can say that also on the other side, on the Russian side, exists some speculation over Holocaust and Babyn Yar, who try to represent Ukrainians as Nazis. That, of course, absolutely absurd, because President Zelensky, when were this accusation, said, how you can accuse me being Nazi if several members of my family, including his great-grandparents and two brothers of his grandfather, perished during Holocaust. Of course, we can say Holocaust continued to be a politicized topic. Babyn Yar continued to be a politicized topic. And we can see how different political forces, often opposite forces, try to use topic of suffering for a current situation to justify what they're doing. However, we can say there are definitely a distortion of history on Russian side, because I visited Kyiv and Babyn Yar a year ago on 80th anniversary of Babyn Yar tragedy, and I can compare a situation in independent Ukraine with a situation that was in Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, I remember lots of state anti-Semitism that inspired popular anti-Semitism, while in independent Ukraine, they have Jewish president, Jewish minister of defense, and definitely much more compassion, benevolent attitude to Jews. And Jews in this 30 years of Ukrainian independence become big patriots of Ukraine. Many of them fight now for Ukrainian independence.
Absolutely, yes. And thank you so much for that. You also mentioned the fact that in the 30 years of independent Ukraine, the creation of the Babyn Yar Memorial was still something of a thorny problem, perhaps less thorny than in the Soviet period, but a controversial one nevertheless. So I wonder if you could comment perhaps on how the debate was shaping itself in the period prior to the Russian invasion, because I have the feeling, having done some work on that recently, that the war has in some ways nullified most of the resistance to the monument. But before, what sort of sides were there in the debate in Ukraine?
It's a very interesting question. When I was about to leave Ukraine, it was 1997 when I immigrated first to Israel and then to United States. Nobody among my Gentile friends know much about Holocaust at all, because there was just silence in Soviet Union since I would say late 1940s about this topic. And when I talk about Jewish tragedy in Babyn Yar, about the execution mostly of Jews in Babyn Yar, they interrupted me and said, everybody suffers there. Why emphasize Jews? Now, nobody tell me this anymore. When I visited Kyiv last year, everybody talk about Jews who perished there. However, they and Gentile historians remind that there were also executed Ukrainian nationalists. That's true, but proportions that 70 to 80,000 Jews and 600 Ukrainian nationalists. This is what we talk about, and several thousand of prisoners of the war who were in concentration camp and who tried to resist, or for whom, for some reason, Nazi executed there. This also true that they buried in Babyn Yar, but again, the public opinion changed for these 30 years. They understood that Babyn Yar, it first of all Jewish tragedy, or tragedy of Jews in Ukraine, but because it happened in Ukrainian land, then of course it should be commemorated on government level. And as I said, there are still ongoing debates what kind of museum should be built there. Everybody talks that project only postponed, that project is not over. And the debates whether it Babyn Yar museum, without mentioning of some specific victim, or it Babyn Yar Holocaust museum. And my position in these debates that of course there should be Babyn Yar Holocaust Museum, because main victims of Babyn Yar were Jews and Roma, majority of victims. And this museum should have some exhibition about other victims, for example, prisoners of the war, members of underground movement, members of Ukrainian resistance. But it should have a name Holocaust Museum, because Holocaust Museum were built in Auschwitz and other places. And I believe that Babyn Yar, one of these places of mass execution of Jews, there definitely should be the Holocaust Museum.
Great, thank you so much. We have a wonderful, very moving question/comment from an audience member, Tatiana Zidevich, and I'm going to read it. Thanks a lot for this very informative and moving presentation. I am a Kyivan who grew up near Babyn Yar in Syrets. Me and my parents always participated in the commemoration of the Babyn Yar massacre every September. Now I am in the USA. My parents left Kyiv after the Russian bombs landed near Babyn Yar, near their home. I wonder if you have any information, if there were any commemoration meetings this year in September. Somehow I have missed the information about it.
Yes, this September, of course, were a much more modest event than last year. Last year, in official commemoration event, participate about 600 people, and this year it were a few dozen people, but it were Ukrainian officials. It were also representative of different religion, and there were collective prayer in Babyn Yar on September 29 by a representative of different confession, religious confessions. And there also continue to work Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. And there was in October advisory meeting of Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, where participate Natan Sharansky and other members, Joel Lieberman by Zoom, several other members by Zoom, main rabbi of Ukraine, Asman, and I saw that in meeting participate also some representative of President of Ukraine office. So we can say even in condition of war, Ukrainian government believes that commemoration of Babyn Yar tragedy is very important because it explains for us basically the Holocaust as a genocidal mechanism. We can say there we can find many similarities. It's of course a question for another talk between Russism and fascism and Nazi regimes in their imperial ambitions, in their genocidal methods, in their dehumanization of their victims. And Ukrainian government very clear understands this, that's why they continue to support the commemoration of this tragedy, even in conditions of the war.
Thank you so much for this answer. And Vika, we don't have a lot of time left, but we do have a little bit of time. So if I could just share a brief memory and then ask you something about it. So I was last in Kyiv a long time ago, actually, in the fall of 2013. So the fall before the annexation of Crimea, which was, of course, a big game changer. So I was, this is when I used to go to Crimea when I was doing research on the Shoah in Crimea. I was in Kyiv with my older daughter, Mira, who was a child at the time and who is now almost 17, but she remembers it distinctly because we were staying in the center. We took a taxi and the taxi driver had a hard time finding Babyn Yar, true story. And then as we wandered around, of course, the big menorah monument was already there, as were some of the other monuments you showed, the children to the Roma victims. But what was striking is that the grounds were really unmanicured, and there was a soccer field very close, trash heaps, and I had mixed feelings about it because on the one hand it felt a little sacrilegious, but on the other it was a kind of raw picture of reality, how memories and commemoration coexisted with ordinary everyday life. And so I guess my question for you is this latest round of memorials, the mirror wall, the mirror field, the crystal wall, they have a very sculptured, polished, designed quality. And I'm curious to know how you feel about that, because are they perhaps a little bit too polished, a little bit too much artifices, as opposed to sort of the raw living memory?
When I see on projects of monuments that were proposed in 1965 on competition and even on monument of 1976, I feel more pain of people who create them because they lived through the war, they lost their relatives during the war. And in Babyn Yar and other Holocaust tragedies, and modern monument more abstractionist, more like modern style. But at the same time, I should admit that in my childhood, when we came with my parents, my grandmother to Soviet monument, we were alone there. Nobody was. I remember this huge monument and nobody around at all. We were only people who came there. Last year, when I came to this new monument during my visit in Kyiv, I saw school children whom brought their teachers there, and they look on all this modern monument and they really interested and they are asking questions. And I think probably language that need talk to modern children, to young generation, because it attracts their attention. And the sound installations that remind the names who perish there continuously, they run this installation. This is also quite important because names not will be forgotten. Soviet monument had just signed to Soviet citizens, to Kyivans who perished there. And now we have names. People obtain again names. So what doing center of Babyn Yar seems for me very important because the main in commemoration that people don't forget the tragedy, and they reach this goal because when were built these new monuments, many my Gentile friends and colleagues came there the first time. They did not come to Soviet monument. Somehow they not interested or they did not know when it was erected about the Holocaust. But now people start really come there for commemoration purposes, not just play football or soccer, but to commemorate victims of Babyn Yar.
Thank you so very much for that. And Professor Hiter, Victoria, I'd like to thank you so much for your presentation, for your very deep knowledge of the context, and for your clear-headed and balanced view, which I so much appreciate. And I'm really looking forward to your book, very much so. I hope you'll speak to us again when the book is published. And in the meantime, I wish you very, very productive year of scholarship and teaching. And also, I want to thank our audience for being here with us. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you later.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the attention of audience, and thank you very much for inviting me and opportunity to talk about my forthcoming book.